All right. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see all of you. And I'm really, really pleased to welcome Rabbi Shai Held as our speaker this evening. So let me first thank the members of the Adult Ed Committee of Kol Ami for all their hard work throughout the year and in putting together this program. This is our third of 3 sessions on Abraham Joshua Heschel. So Rabbi Held, just so you know, there's a core of folks here who have been studying together the last couple of weeks, who have looked at some of the texts of Heschel, especially on prophecy and social justice. And then there are some that are joining us tonight for the first time who haven't been with us the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to introduce our speaker, and then I'll just turn it over to him. There also are some texts to share, which I'll put into the chat in just a moment. So Rabbi Shai Held, theologian, scholar, and educator, is president and dean at Hadar. He has taught both theology and halakha at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and also served as Director of Education at Harvard Hillel, a 2011 recipient of the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education. Rabbi Held has been named multiple times to Newsweek's list of the 50 most influential rabbis in America. He holds a doctorate in religion from Harvard. His main academic interests are in modern Jewish and Christian thought, in biblical theology, and in the history of Zionism. Rabbi Held's first book, Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, was published by Indiana University in 2013. The Heart of Torah, his second book, a collection of essays on the Torah in 2 volumes, was published by JPS in 2017. And his next book, Judaism is About Love, will be published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux in 2023. So I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Held. And as I do so, I'm just going to drop a link into the chat here, which is the texts for this talk. So you can, that way you can access them as well. And Rabbi Held, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Micah. Thank you, everyone. Good evening. So I'm going to dive right in to what I think of as the most essential, I don't know about the most essential, one of the most essential questions and themes in Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's writing, and also I think a often not fully understood theme. So I want to talk about wonder and amazement, 2 of the most basic ideas in Heschel's worldview, and why they matter so much to him. And I guess I want to begin by saying, Heschel is often quoted, he's often revered and admired, but the deep structure of his thought is not all that often explored or understood. In some ways, he's the victim of his own eloquence, in that people treat him as a kind of Jewish Bartlett's book of quotations. It's Friday afternoon, the rabbi hasn't decided what she's going to speak on, and she pulls off a volume of Heschel and finds a line that speaks to her, and is off to the races. And the truth is, Heschel repays that. He writes beautifully. But I think one of the things that gets lost is, what is his project as a religious thinker and as a philosopher? So we'll start with this. Ask a fairly well-educated Jew for one word they associate with Abraham Joshua Heschel, and you might well get the answer: wonder. And on the face of it, that's a bit strange, because if I asked you for the 50 most foundational words in Jewish theology or spirituality, it's really not clear that wonder would make the list. The Hebrew word pele is not on your obvious list of Judaism's most essential words. I think it's actually unlikely it would make that list. So at first glance, at least, it's strange that Heschel is so preoccupied with wonder, that he's so convinced that it lies at the very heart of what it means to be Jewish, and more fundamentally, of what it means to be human. Wonder, he thinks, is essential and fundamental to our humanity. If we lose wonder, we lose something that is fundamental to our humanity. So let's ask, why is wonder so fundamental? What does it mean anyway? What attitude or approach to life does it potentially and ideally lead to? And how does a person suffused with a sense of wonder carry themselves in the world? So we'll dig in at the very beginning point for him. According to Heschel, all human beings have a natural proclivity to wonder, a sense of what he calls, I'm going to quote here, a sense of unmitigated innate surprise. Unmitigated innate surprise. And you can look on the source sheet at source 1 for an example of his articulation of that. A sense of wonder, of appreciation or amazement is constitutive of who we are as human beings, right? As I just said a minute ago, part of what it means to be human is to have a sense of wonder. But I want to underscore wonder, as I understand Heschel, is not merely an emotion or an experience. It's not even primarily, I think, an emotion or an experience. It's a way of holding ourselves in the world. My extraordinarily pretentious way of saying this is it's an existential posture. It's an attitude towards life and the world. Okay? Now, that's important because you can't build a worldview on an emotion because emotions come and go, as anyone who's ever had an emotion knows, right? You know, you're angry 1 minute and 5 minutes later you're in a good mood, or vice versa. You can't build a marriage only on the emotion of love. You build a marriage to some degree on the posture of love, and emotion is a manifestation of that more fundamental commitment. Okay? So perhaps surprisingly for some of us, Heschel claims that all religious awareness and insight are rooted in this very primary sense of wonder. What he called unmitigated innate surprise. I'm going to try to dig deeper into what that means in a minute, but I want to first observe that there is a challenge that life throws in the path of wonder, which is routinization, right? We do the same stuff every day. We get into habits and we cease to find things new or surprising. I remember when I was a young rabbi and almost comically pretentious in certain ways. I was 28 years old. I was working as a rabbi at a Hillel. I walked into the kitchen of the Hillel building one day and I said to the cook, "Hey, Randy, what's up?" And he said, same stuff, different day. Only he didn't say stuff, right? He said, same stuff, different day. And I, in my insanity, said, "No, Randy, the whole point is different stuff, new day." But that's really what he was conveying in a way, was what one of the things Heschel worries about, which is routines dull our sense of wonder. And that means that one of the tasks of religion is to help resist the dulling of our wonder, the desensitization to being surprised by the world. That is one of the tasks of liturgy. So look, for example, look at source 2. Okay? Everyone has it. He says here, every evening we recite, God creates light and makes the dark. Twice a day we say, God is one. What is the meaning of such repetition? A scientific theory, once it is announced and accepted, does not have to be repeated twice a day. The insights of wonder, I'm going to add a phrase here, in contrast, must be constantly kept alive. Since there is a need for daily wonder, there is a need for daily worship. That is a crucial sentence for him. Since there is a need for daily wonder, there is a need for daily worship. That is to say, religion, when it works, helps keep wonder alive. When it works is a very significant caveat, because as you know, Judaism embraces this incredibly complex dialectic or tension between, on the one hand, religion as supposed to awaken us to new openness to the world, and yet doing it with very familiar liturgy, right? Religion too can become routinized, and at that point it becomes hard for it to be a vehicle for wonder. Now, at the risk of digging almost too deep for a minute, I want to just observe, in case some of you have come upon these phrases, it seems to me that even though they are often presented interchangeably, at times even by Heschel, wonder and amazement are actually different things, or they are not fully synonymous. And I'm saying that based on certain passages in Heschel, not all of them. Wonder is a sense of being surprised that there is anything at all. Radical amazement is what we might call reflexive wonder. I think to myself, it's amazing that there's a world at all. And then I think, it's amazing that I can perceive that there's a world at all. And it's amazing that I can process my perception and cultivate a thought about it. And it's amazing that I can actually, as a human being, think about my thinking. That's radical amazement, kind of wonder turned on itself. Or to put it differently, according to Heschel, all moments of radical amazement are also moments of wonder, but not all moments of wonder are also moments of radical amazement, right? One of the ways that I put that in my book on Heschel, in case this is useful for anyone, is wonder is what I call a low voltage religious experience. Radical amazement is a high voltage religious experience. I think Heschel would say you can have wonder all the time, but you can't have radical amazement all the time. And that's probably a good thing, because if you were radically amazed all the time, nobody would ever make lunch. Like you wouldn't really function because you'd be in this kind of like, whoa status, which is not what he's really talking about. Now, it's crucial for Heschel to emphasize, and this kind of will resonate to a lot of discussions many of us are familiar with from our own time, um, that wonder is not acquired or defended through fear of science. You can look at source 4 for an example of him saying that, where he argues that wonder is what he calls a form of thinking. That's source 5, right? Wonder is not acquired by science, it is rather a way of thinking. In other words, it is really important to Heschel to demolish an assumption that, interestingly, is often shared by religion's most vitriolic critics and its most impassioned defenders. That is, that wonder depends on, or worse, is synonymous with, ignorance of science, right? You get that from both a certain stripe of believer and from many non-believers. And by the way, here's an interesting example of what Heschel doesn't mean by wonder. Richard Dawkins, um, in a particularly smug passage, I have to say, I find this to be a really like strange formulation. In his book Unweaving the Rainbow, he describes how the scientist encounters something amazing and experiences wonder, but then says, "But we're working on it." And I think Heschel would say, "But we're working on it." Wonder is not the same as not knowing or understanding something. Wonder is a way of approaching something. The more science you know, the more wonder you might feel, not the less, right? So I think that Dawkins is an interesting counterweight in this way. It's almost not fair because Dawkins is, as a philosopher, I mean, he's not a philosopher, as a thinker, so incredibly, I would say, unnuanced when it comes to questions of religion. Now, another way of saying this is that for Heschel, wonder does not rely on a God of the gaps. Are people familiar with that term, God of the gaps? No, okay. So, God of the gaps is a term that is used by kind of theologians who are in conversation with science. And God of the gaps is a kind of pejorative term for the kind of theology that says, okay, well, there are things that science doesn't yet understand. Those are the gaps in our understanding where we see the hand of God. The God of the gaps theology is criticized because, first of all, the gaps keep closing, right? It's a kind of a bit of fool's gold for a believer to say, "Oh, we don't understand how DNA works. It must be the hand of God." In about 20 years ago, all the rage in science education was combating what is known as intelligent design. Intelligent design theory is the classic modern example of God of the gaps theology, right? You look for things that you think evolution does not adequately explain, and you say, "Oh, there's God." But of course, most scientists disagree with that. And my point here is that Heschel's not interested in the gaps. He's not interested, and this is really kind of gets to the key of what I think is Heschel is up to with wonder. It's not this fact or that is the primary source of wonder, but rather, to use a phrase of Heschel's, the fact that there are facts at all. The fact that there are facts at all. Or to put this more in the language of philosophy, if this is helpful for anyone, wonder is a response to the contingency of being. None of this had to be. Why is there something rather than nothing? Religion is a response to what Heschel calls, I love this phrase, the unexpectedness of being as such. The unexpectedness of being as such. One of the things I often tell students when we're studying Heschel, and for those students who feel like, wait, what does he really mean by this? I often suggest to them, inhale, and then ask the question, who made that? Where'd that come from? Why is that a thing? If you'll allow me to talk like a 19-year-old, right? Why is that a thing? Like, what is that, right? And so the unexpectedness of being as such, right? There's a world. Why is there a world? So in other words, the primary datum, if you will, that wonder responds to is not this thing or that. It's not this flower, that river, this person, that human face. All those things can be part of wonder, but they're not the primary source of wonder. The primary source of wonder is, why is there anything at all? Okay? People often get this wrong, I think, in their popular presentations of Heschel. Now's going to come the leap where I suspect that at least some of us are going to say, wait a minute, you just lost me. Okay? This is, I think, where the seams in Heschel's thinking begin to show. Okay? According to Heschel, our question, why is there a world? Why is there anything? Contains an answer in disguise. That's his phrase. The very question of why there is something rather than nothing, Heschel thinks, already points to the idea of someone who created and gave us this world as a gift. For Heschel, that statement does not require a leap at all. He's not making an inference, he's articulating an intuition. Distinction between those two things clear? He's not saying, oh, wonder, therefore logically there must be a God. He's saying something like, wonder, I'm filled with amazement, and that perception already is an awareness of God. Now, I don't want to get totally lost in this, but I will just say it's almost like I have often imagined Heschel sitting with, a South Asian Buddhist monk reading who responds to Heschel by saying, "You were totally with me on the wonder stuff, but then when you started talking about a source or a God who gave this to us, I don't really know what you're talking about anymore." And one of the things that I think I argued this at length in my book, for whatever it's worth, one of the things I think is Heschel's most significant weakness as a thinker is that he's not really aware of how much his perceptions of the world are shaped by the culture he's in. Meaning he thinks his perceptions are universal. So if you tell Heschel, I don't feel wonder, he'll say, well, I will try to elicit it because I know that deep down everyone feels it. And I'm not so persuaded at the end of the day that that's accurate or even helpful. In his defense, a lot of people thought this way in the 1950s and 60s, and he died just as philosophers were sort of moving on from the idea that you could kind of get at some universal pre-cultural way of experiencing the world. I want to say one more sentence, and then I'm going to stop to take questions about this first part. Bertrand Russell famously said, why is there something rather than nothing? The world is a brute fact. I think Heschel would say, I don't even know what it means to say that the world is a brute fact. The world is an irreducible mystery. And all that exists, here's that leap again, stems from a transcendent source. Okay, questions. Let's not, I don't want to take responses yet. I want to take questions about what Heschel is saying or how I've presented him. Anything at all people want to, I see Peter's screen hand is up.
So it almost sounds to me like what you're saying about Heschel is what I think it was Aristotle said, I think, therefore I am.
So it's funny that you said it's not Aristotle, it's Descartes who says, I think, therefore I am. I'm going to talk about Descartes a little bit later because I think Heschel sees himself as attacking Descartes. It's not, I'll say one sentence now and then come back to it later. The problem with I think, therefore I am is that it begins with I. Whereas for Heschel, I is never the first word we say. Because before we even have a sense of a self, we have a sense of amazement that there's anything at all. If that sounds very abstract or vague for now, I beg your forbearance, and I will come back to your question. Okay, great, thank you.
I have a
Rabbi, yes.
question. Yeah, I can't raise my hand, I think, because I'm the host, but my question actually took a couple different forms as you were talking, but the first version of it was, you said something like, wonder isn't high on the list of Jewish words. But then I thought that maybe in Chassidut it is. So I wondered how much of this for Heschel comes from his Hasidic background. And then the second version of the question was, when you talk, the last thing you said sounded to me kind of like Buber, this idea that you can't describe God, you can only experience God, right? That sort of God, it's not this world is evidence of God, sort of like rational evidence, but rather when I experience this world, I am sort of experiencing God. So I guess I wonder how much of this comes back to the Hasidic idea of sort of being in amazement and being in the presence of God, as opposed to the neo-Kantian, let's try to explain what God is.
So you're only allowed to ask me one hard question per time, Micah, not two.
Okay.
So 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 let me say about the first piece. It may very well be that the influence here is Hasidic, but one of the things that seems important to me to say is when people say that Heschel is writing a kind of Hasidic theology for the modern world, I have a lot of reservations about that, because while I think the awareness of God being as real as your right hand, if I may be permitted that phrase, is Hasidic, for Heschel, Hasidism is always filtered through the Bible. In that, and if this sounds really abstract, feel free to tune this out for a minute. In the Hasidic world, you have a lot of people who seem to think, whatever this might mean, that the lines between God and human being can be blurred in experience. I don't think Heschel thinks that at all. Heschel is covenantal all the way down. Covenant implies two: I am not God, God is not me. So there is a deep cultural influence of Chassidut, but the theology is not exactly Hasidic. I've tried to argue in various, more academic settings, that Heschel is a biblical theologian first and a Hasidic thinker only second. The connection to Buber is like an astute one. It's a really complex discussion about what the relationship is between them, and I say that because I find it a little bit opaque at times. Buber exercised a lot of influence on Heschel, and yet I think Heschel thought that there was much more you could say about God than Buber did. I think Buber was much more, if you will, pardon the ironic use of the term, orthodox in his Buberianism than Heschel was. Heschel really thought that the Bible revealed stuff about God. It wasn't just an encounter that led to it. The Bible God reveals something of God's self in the Bible in a way that Buber would never have said, and that licenses Heschel to believe he can say stuff about who God is that Buber was more wary of. I hope that that's a little helpful.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
So where does wonder lead us? Like, why should we care about what we're talking about here? So first, it's worth saying, wonder for Heschel is decidedly, to use another phrase of his, not a state of aesthetic enjoyment. To sort of perhaps belabor some of what I've said already, this is not the wonder that you experience looking at a Picasso. That may be a form of wonder too, but this is something other than that. And Heschel insists that authentic wonder always carries a question and a challenge within it. The sentence that appears more often than any other in the corpus of Heschel's writing is this: something is asked of us. That's the kind of primal religious awareness. Wonder leads to a sense that something is asked of us. And that question, to use another phrase from Heschel, demands our whole being as an answer. Religion is born, in other words, in the awareness of that question, the experience of wonder and the question that is asked of us as part of the experience of wonder. I don't want to get too bogged down in this here, but it's at least worth noting that for Heschel, this sense that something is asked of us is the portal in human experience that makes us open to the possibility of receiving revelation. In other words, we have this primal awareness that something is asked of us. And then we might be tempted to ask, okay, but what? And religions come to try to answer that question. Give me a nod if that makes sense. I got a couple of nods. Okay. Religion is an attempt to answer that question. Now, if I could, Phil, can I? Is your question burning, or can I wait a few minutes to come to it?
You can wait a few minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Because I want to just kind of develop this just a little bit more. Another way of saying this is that for Heschel, wonder is entwined with indebtedness. Look at source 6. I want to read this together for a minute. The soul is endowed with a sense of indebtedness, and wonder, awe, and fear unlock that sense of indebtedness. Wonder is the state of our being asked. There's that notion again. In spite of our pride, in spite of our acquisitiveness, we are driven by an awareness that something is asked of us, that we are asked to wonder, to revere, to think, and to live in a way that is compatible with the grandeur and mystery of living. What gives birth to religion is not intellectual curiosity, but the fact and experience of our being asked. And then source 7, how shall we ever reciprocate for breathing and thinking, for sight and hearing, for love and achievement? This is Heschel's own version of a line you may be familiar with from the Hallel prayers, Ma'ashiv ladonai kol tagmulohi alai. How could I possibly pay God for all of the beneficence, for all of the wonders and the gifts that God has bestowed upon me? So, according to Heschel, in other words, a sense of indebtedness is constitutive of our being human. And if we had 2 hours and we were in person, one of the questions I would ask you is whether that resonates for you. That a sense of being indebted is part of what makes us human beings. All right, you know what? Let me actually take a pause there, Phil. This is a good moment to let you get in here.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is his view of religion that something is asked of us or that something is commanded of us? Because those are very different things.
Yeah, that's a
Most
wonderful
orthodox
question.
religious belief is that things are demanded and commanded of us, not just asked of us.
Yeah, wow. I think what he would say, and this might be a little bit of an evasion, although it's an evasion, I don't know if it's on my part or his part, is that, let me think how to say this. Wonder elicits a sense that something is asked of us. Revelation tells us that something is more than just asked of us, it's demanded of us. In other words, I think he's arguing that this basic human experience of wonder is not strong enough to generate a sense of command. It generates a sense of ask. But then if I open myself up to revelation, obviously its own topic for another year, but if I open myself up to revelation, I learn that, it's more than an ask. It's a kind of, the source of being has something that it needs from me. So it's almost like revelation intensifies the basic human awareness. It if you will, it dials the basic human experience up to 11. Yeah, I mean, and I mean, I'm saying that playfully, but I think that's actually the point. Whether that's a good answer or not, I'm honestly not sure. I mean, philosophically and otherwise, but I think that's what Heschel would say. Peter?
Actually, Rabbi, it's Joy Vanek.
Hi.
Hi. I've always been the type of person that has been thankful for every day, for everything that I have, for everything that I enjoy and experience. When I think of indebtedness and I think of thankfulness, it's two different things. When I am indebted, to me, it's I then owe you something back. If in fact I am indebted for that which I have, then is my obligation or what I owe back is my devotion to my God and the following of my religion?
Okay, so that is a wonderful question, and one of the reasons I was smiling is in the second to final draft of the book that I just finished, there was a long discussion about the relationship between gratitude and indebtedness. And my editor told me that was too much of a discussion that only philosophers would care about. But which was somehow meant to be a slur. But hey, one of the things that led me to that is that I think you're picking up on something really interesting, which is that Heschel tends to think of gratitude and indebtedness as interchangeable. And at least in our time, most people do not. And one of the ways that we know that is that when Gallup, the same people who do all those political polls, when Gallup interviews people about emotions, I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but it was something like 93% of people found gratitude to be a positive emotion, but only like 40% thought of indebtedness as a positive emotion. So obviously people don't experience them as the same. However, and this is totally not Heschel, this is just me talking. I've come to think that one of the things that does not help us in our culture is that we don't have a fine-grained enough language around indebtedness. Because I think, if I can coin a very, very, very sophisticated way of saying this, I think there is good indebtedness and bad indebtedness. Good indebtedness is like, I went through a severe depression. Most of my friends gave up on me. You refused to walk away from me. And now I love you and want to be close to you because I feel, I owe you so much, and that's a good feeling. Bad indebtedness is like, I was in debt financially. The lady who lives across the street lent me $1,000, which she never tires of reminding me she did from the goodness of her heart. That's bad indebtedness. I think that gratitude and good indebtedness are actually very similar. Gratitude and bad indebtedness are opposites, because gratitude, I think, actually is usually a posture that brings me, if I feel grateful to you, then it's almost like I want to be close to you. But if I feel bad indebtedness, I just wish you would leave me alone. So I would just want to nuance our discussion a bit. But I think you've picked up on a real weakness in Heschel's formulation here. One of the many things I would have loved to ask him is, can we try to parse out a little bit where you're talking about gratitude and where you're talking about indebtedness? I wonder whether indebtedness is also a term that he thinks helps him, because indebtedness you could translate into Hebrew as chiyuv, obligation, which is an essential term in the whole kind of rabbinic and biblical understanding of our relationship to God. But it doesn't make it less problematic to slip between those two things. I hope I've answered your question. It's a really good question. Thank you. So now the next step in all this, and this is going to kind of begin to take us to where the rubber hits the road for Heschel, I think, in a very deep way. In many ways, I think this is what mattered most to Heschel as a kind of spiritual teacher and an ethical guide. There are two ways of being in the world, he says. We have wonder. Let me say it differently. We have the way of wonder on the one hand, and what he calls the way of expediency on the other. Now, expediency, at least for me, this might make me seem like a very odd person, but expediency is one of those words that I could use in a sentence, but until I started reading Heschel, I didn't actually know what it meant. So I want to take a minute to define what I think expediency means, especially for Heschel. Okay? Expediency is essentially being driven by the question, how can this serve me? What does this do to further my ends? Okay? So if there are two ways of living in the world, the way of wonder and the way of expediency, that distinction lies at the heart of what religion is. If you look at source 8, you'll see a wonderful formulation of this, where in the way of expediency, we accumulate information in order to dominate. But in the way of wonder, we deepen our appreciation in order to respond. In other words, right, expediency essentially is about turning the world into a toolbox for my own aims. Wonder is about fundamentally being responsive to that which comes from outside me. Okay? Now, Heschel says at one point, probably should have brought this sentence because I think it's really, it's a great example of a sentence that sounds great, but until you understand what he's doing, you don't realize that he's actually saying something really profound. He says at one point, mankind will not perish for want of information, but only for want of appreciation. Because appreciation is what makes me feel grateful and indebted. Right? But information is not an ethical posture. Information just allows me to do more with the world. So yet another way of saying that, if this is helpful, the way of expediency closes us off to what is outside us, whereas the way of wonder awakens us to the ways we're connected to all things. So what that means for Heschel is that all of life is a struggle between self-assertion, that's the way of expediency on the one hand, and self-transcendence, that's the way of wonder. Now, I'll explain what self-transcendence means in just a second. But another formulation that Heschel uses is that we have, on the one hand, the impulse to acquire, to enjoy, and to possess. That's expediency. And on the other hand, the urge to respond, to yield, to give. That's the way of wonder. I argued in my book, I'm more or less still persuaded this is true, that self-transcendence is the very heart of Heschel's theology and spirituality. Self-transcendence is a very schmaltzy, grandiose term that most of us, I think, really don't know what we mean if we use it. I think for Heschel, self-transcendence actually means something fairly straightforward. It's caring about other selves. It's what he calls transitive concern. Think of like the term transitive verb, as opposed to reflexive concern. Reflexive concern means I care about myself. I have to have reflexive concern in order to survive as organic life. But if all I have is reflexive concern, what's most human about me is completely destroyed. I have to have transitive concern. It's not just my suffering that matters, it's Wayne's suffering that matters. It's Phil's suffering, it's Joy's suffering, etc. Right? And one of Heschel's great beliefs is that human beings do really have the momentous capacity to choose self-transcendence, not once and for all time. We all, I think, if we're in any way self-aware, are aware of times when we've done something really kind and generous, and like an hour later, we actually find ourselves being incredibly selfish or petulant or whatever it might be. And like, you don't transcend the self forever. You transcend the self ideally at moments. He puts it this way: the grand premise of religion is that man is able to surpass himself. And in a different year, in a different discussion, I might argue that one of the ways that Judaism is different from, say, Lutheranism is that the premise of a lot of Martin Luther's theology is that human beings can't transcend their ego. We are stuck forever in our sense of selfishness. And Heschel thinks at moments, at least, we can rise above that. Now, I just want to sort of be clear. Descriptively, of course, religion can feed and stoke all of our worst impulses. Prescriptively, its job is to cultivate our good ones. And if you look at source 9, you see one particular formulation of this in Heschel that I find really interesting. I'm still not sure all these years later that I fully understand it, but the will to power and the will to believe are mutually exclusive. For in our striving for power, we arrogate to ourselves what belongs to God and suppress the claim of God's presence. That's just a really rich and provocative formulation. When you affirm God, you renounce the fantasy of holding power over other people. That's an wildly idealistic, right, formulation. It might be that living in a deeply broken and imperfect world, it doesn't always work that way. But that's at least what Heschel is interested in driving us towards. Or to put it very simply, God's presence is a call to self-transcendence. God's presence means be awake to other people, be awake to God's will, be awake to other people's will, be responsive to other people's needs. Wonder, in other words, makes us realize that we are not in charge, that our egos are not the center of the universe. I often think about how it's the most almost universal, if you will, illusion. Because we all experience the world through our own consciousness, we are often led to the illusion that our consciousness really is the center of the universe, but it's only the center of our universe. And my consciousness is no more the center of the universe than Phil's consciousness is the center of the universe, which is to say neither of them is the center of the universe. Now that is discursively, that's a totally obvious thing to say, but I think Heschel would say experientially, we've all, I promise you this, how's this for a bold and over the top formulation? We've all had moments in our lives where if we took a step back and watched ourselves, we were operating as if the way we perceive the world is the objective reality of the universe. Many of us operate only that way, right? You have your opinion, I have the right opinion. Now, this is why, Peter, to go back to your question from a long time ago now, this is really not Descartes. Let's put it like this. For Descartes, I can doubt everything there is except myself. So I start from the I. But for Heschel, I can't start from the I because just the very ability to say I already reminds me that I'm not the author of my own self. My very ability to say I is a gift that didn't come from me. Or to put it differently, Jews say modeh ani when they wake up, or moda ani traditionally, right? Grateful am I. Gratitude comes before I. And I think that's really actually quite different. If that's still not clear, when I stop in a couple minutes, I can try to say it in a different way. So what all this yields is a very different conception and experience of the self. Here's another formulation from Heschel. I think I did not include this in the sheet. The mystery is not there while we are here. The truth is that we are all steeped in it, imbibed with it. We are partly it. I am a mystery, right? Again, just to belabor that for a second, for Descartes, there's a sovereign autonomous self. For Heschel, that's totally wrong. Before I ask any question, I am already aware that something has been given to me and that now something is asked of me. Or another formulation of his, I have neither initiated nor conceived the worth and meaning of my life. The essence of what I am is not mine. I am what is not mine. Now, this is not what your mother meant when she told you you were God's gift, but we are all of us God's gift. All of us. Because we didn't make ourselves. Hu asanu v'lo anachnu, in the language of Psalm 100. God made us and not we ourselves. In other words, for Heschel, the Cartesian beginning with the I is a form of self-assertion. It asserts me and then questions everything else. But true self-transcendence rejects these premises. It begins with God and questions the self. Or to sort of say this in another way of Heschel that I personally have found like very moving in my own life, even if I fail to live up to it in 1,001 ways all the time. For Heschel, the flip is God is the asker and we are the asked. God is the thinker and we are the thought of. God is the subject and we are the object of God's knowledge. So it's if there is an I at the center of the universe, it is God's I, if you will. I, the letter I mean. Okay. Any more questions until now? And then I just want to take one last step in all this. Questions?
I
Micah.
have another question. The way of wonder, the idea of transitive concern, how much of that, or to any extent for Heschel, is that an imitation of God? Because he also believes that God has transitive concern, right? God cares about us. So
Yeah.
is it imitatio Dei? Like, are we imitating God by having that, or is that sort of like the
Yeah.
image of God within us?
It is imitatio Dei. It is the imitation of God. One of the things Heschel argues, and I will say I do not think this is a great reading of the Bible, but it is a very beautiful reading, is to argue that God has no reflexive concern at all. God does not think of God itself. God is all transitive. Excuse me. God is all transitive concern. God only cares about others. Now, I think it's hard to read parts of the book of Exodus and take that as a reading of or Ezekiel, right? Where God's ego about God's self-perception is a big issue, right? But I think Heschel, forget about the Bible for a minute, as a theological ideal, he's describing something really beautiful and powerful. And so God becomes the model to emulate. In fact, by the way, I mean, I don't think this is exactly our topic. One of the things that I've tried to argue is one of the things that he really finds most frustrating about Maimonides is that he thinks, if you worship a God who doesn't care, you won't care either. Whereas if you worship a God who's transitive concern, you'll have transitive concern too. Okay. Phil?
When Heschel's talking about the will to power, is he specifically talking about the will of one person to have power over other people? Or is he talking about the will of humanity to have power over the whole rest of the world?
I suspect both. It's both about interpersonal brutality and human overrun. I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting is that these themes in Heschel anticipate a lot of sort of the environmental crisis and kind of ecologically minded theology. I mean, if we're kind of going into the la la land of intellectual history, here Heschel is influenced by Heidegger, who was preoccupied with the idea that human beings had turned the world into what he called a resource, something they could use as opposed to something they could value. There's a whole thing of 20th century Jewish thinkers who are deeply influenced by Heidegger, but ambivalent about admitting it because Heidegger was such an awful human being. But the ideas there, I think, are important to them. Okay, so let me take one more step. Why is all this so important in the modern world? And for Heschel, his kind of core perception of the modern world is that we've essentially gone off the rails. Instead of cultivating a sense of appreciation for the sheer wondrousness of being, modern people simply take the world for granted, and what's worse, treat it as little more than a vast reservoir of information and an opportunity to utilize things for our own ends. If you look at source 10, our age is one in which usefulness is thought to be the chief merit of nature, in which the attainment of power, the utilization of its resources, is taken to be the chief purpose of man in God's creation. Man has indeed become primarily a tool-making animal, and the world is now a gigantic toolbox for the satisfaction of his needs. This is an allusion, I think, to the famous essay by Martin Heidegger about the culture of technology. In other words, to go back to language we introduced a few minutes ago, expediency rules the day. The modern question is not how can I respond? That's the religious question. The modern question is how can I use this? So there's two steps in the death of wonder. One we started with, which is routinization. But the other, and much more dangerous one, is instrumentalization, where we turn the world as something we can use. People worship at the altar of expediency. We only ask whether and how the world can serve them. And this, by the way, now this is me talking, not Heschel, right? You have many American rabbis who try to sell religion to their congregants by calling it a technology or by asking how it can serve them. Heschel would scream his head off at that language because I think what he would say is, at the end of the day, when you frame it that way, you've already lost the battle. Because religion too becomes a tool of expediency. Why do I do religious things? Because they serve me. No, the purpose of religion is to remind you that whether something can serve you is not the only question in a human life. Religion is a way of asking, what can I serve? Here's Heschel for a minute. The essence of religion does not lie in the satisfaction of a human need. As long as man sees religion as a source of satisfaction for his own needs, it is not God whom he serves, but his own self. That's basically a version of saying what I just said, I think. Now, so to go back to something I said earlier, the danger in the collapse of wonder is not aesthetic. It might be that also, but it's ethical and theological. The decline of wonder spells the end of a sense for anything transcendent, and that means that modern people do not feel called or compelled by anything or anyone outside themselves. Now, obviously, this is an extremely broad brush to paint with, but he's describing a culture. As he says at one point, forfeit your sense of awe, and the universe becomes a marketplace for you. Or, a civilization that is devoted exclusively to the utilitarian is at bottom not different from barbarism. Right? So it's that relentless self-assertion that has made the kind of callousness and cruelty that modernity has excelled at possible. And that has brought humanity, and I will add here now, and the earth, to unimaginable devastation. And what Heschel wants to argue is that reorientation is necessary so that we realize that life is not about claims we make, but about claims that are made upon us. That's that nexus again of asking, being asked and being commanded that Phil pointed to the seams of earlier. That reorientation, I think, for Heschel, is what is most distinctive and essential about religion. Religion is not a weekend hobby for the upper middle class. Religion is not about Kiddush to see Goldberg. Religion is actually about being reoriented to asking how I can serve rather than how the world can serve me. And that, Heschel thinks, is the only thing that can save us. Now, again, remember, religion can also be toxic and poisonous. So it's a complicated thing. It's not just a balm. It's a very dangerous balm. Right? It has, I mean, if ever there was a double-edged sword, it's religion, right? Now, I guess I should say, in case this is not clear, it's not technology that is a problem here. It's the technological way of seeing the world, always asking how things can serve me. You see it, by the way, just here's a really almost pedantic and over-the-top example. I often think about this when I'm walking in Manhattan. All these yoga studios that will say things like, give yourself a gift, ask how yoga can serve you. Is that really the way we should be talking about a many thousands-year-old religious tradition? Right? Ask how yoga can serve you? What yogi would talk that way? None. That's, I mean, a whole nother discussion we could have that Heschel does not explicitly have is the whole question of Heschel's theology and capitalism. That's a whole nother discussion that I'll leave for another day. 5 years from now, Rabbi Stryper, when you do Heschel again, you'll invite me. We'll talk about capitalism. No, I mean he doesn't talk about it, so it's just my kind of trying to play around with his ideas. But okay, now I want to say one last thing, and then I'll stop and we can take questions or thoughts. Even theology can become a tool that we use to serve our ends. And I will not belabor this. If this is hard to follow, I'll withdraw it because I'm not sure it's worth our time. You probably have more pressing things to talk about in terms of Heschel. But is God an answer to our questions, or are we supposed to be answers to God's questions? God is not a tool or a hypothesis that we invoke to make our philosophical systems work. God is a shattering reality that has the potential, at least, to tear our selfishness to shreds. In other words, God, too, can be co-opted by the culture of expediency. Okay. And I'll just end by saying, speaking personally, one of my great anxieties about all this is that I believe with my whole heart that religion, Torah, can do exactly the work Heschel imagines it doing. But I look around the world so often and I see it doing quite the contrary. And I find that to be somewhere between sobering and crushing, depending on the day. And I think it's worth saying that. In other words, I think that the answer is not more or less religion, but more of what kind of religion. And that is not a denominational question at all. That is not what I mean in any way, right? It's about like, or another way of saying this is, I often find myself saying these days, I'm not that interested in the question of whether or not you believe in God, because Osama bin Laden believed in God, and look where that led him. I'm interested in what kind of God you believe in, right? And I think that that's an important. I think Heschel would endorse that. At times he comes close to saying that, but I think it's really important to say in our own time, living as we do, um, in a time when religion can contribute so profoundly to so much social ill. Um, okay, well, let me take now questions, responses, reflections. I hope I haven't completely lost you. People are, I think, sense that people are with me. So, I don't know which one of you is raising your hand in the Vanek household.
It's both
It's
of
both
us.
of us.
Both of you. Okay,
So Joy will
great.
go first.
When you talked about routineness, I've always felt that routine grounds us or can ground us on a day-to-day basis. In order to work through life, whether you're talking weekday or Shabbat, you still have to have something that is routine. I think the humanist needs that. That being said, I also think that God grounds us. I think that God in our lives grounds us to moral and ethical being and an acknowledgement of again being either indebtedness to him or grateful, but also to know what fellow man needs. In other words, to serve our fellow man, not just exist from day to day.
Yeah, so let me let me pick up for a second on the first part of what you said, because I think it's exactly right, and it's worth underscoring. Routine is necessary and also dangerous. The answer is not to do away with routine, right? As you say, I don't think we can do that. The answer is to find a way to have routine be non-dulling. And again, Judaism does this. This is what, in the tradition is called the tension between keva and kavanah, between fixed prayer and the movement of the heart. And you can say, and it's not always wrong, right? You can say, well, fixed prayer gets in the way of the movement of the heart. To which someone like Heschel would say, yeah, but fixed prayer is also what enables the movement of the heart. So the question is, how do you have fixed prayer that is enlivening rather than deadening? So that's the question about routine. I don't think the question is routine or no routine. Because, anthropologists talk about this all the time. We all need structure. Can't function otherwise, right? You really can't function. Imagine if someone said to you, for a year, I'm not going to tell you, you're not allowed to know what day of the week it is. Many of us would actually be driven completely insane, right? It's just routine, right? We need that to ground us. But routine we have to find a way to not allow routine to deaden us. That's really, I think, the point. Peter, you're up.
Joy's much more eloquent than I am. First a comment and then a question. Everything that you said about Heschel seems to me, and it may just be Heschel putting his thoughts and his beliefs into action, but everything you said about him made me think about his social action, the picture that it invoked is the one with him standing next to Martin Luther King and Rabbi Eisendrath. So that's the first thing that I got from what you said. The other thing I'm thinking of, and it's far more complicated, I think, is you made a comment, and I'm not going to try and quote you, but Heschel is biblically religious or words to that effect. And if it's God-centric, And God endows us with, the word used, bear with me, I'll find it. With wonder and indebtedness and all those things. How do you explain, and it was actually in last week's Torah portion, where God wants to wipe out the people. And he does that, and God does that, or threatens to do that many times in the Bible.
Yeah. Okay, so let me first say something about your first comment. I think that is obviously right. One of the things that I find interesting is that Heschel became an activist somewhat later in his life, and I think you can argue that whether or not this was conscious or not, he was laying the theological foundations for his own activism during his earlier years, meaning there's a theology of social justice that is essential here. And I didn't go there because I have the sense from Rabbi Schreifer that you guys already talked about the kind of the prophetic God. But, for Heschel, one of the things that is so essential is, this is Shai Held talking, not Heschel, but Heschel would, I think, agree with this formulation. You say to God, God, I love you. And God says, well, that's wonderful, but I love widows and orphans. Right? And so if you're going to love me, what's your relationship to widows and orphans? What's your relationship to the downtrodden? So I think that what you're saying is quite important. Now, Heschel has a lot to say about divine anger as described in the Bible. Some of which personally I find very moving, and some of which I think is not entirely convincing. Let me put it, it's a similar thing to what I said to Micah earlier. I think it is beautiful as theology and not always compelling as biblical interpretation. One of the things that Heschel argues, and again, this is the part that as someone who's, my parents were the age of most of my friends' grandparents when I was growing up. My parents were European refugees. And when I first read these passages in Heschel, I found them extremely moving. He says, people are embarrassed that the God of the Bible gets angry. But in fact, a God who didn't get angry would be a worthless God. Because in a world where children are murdered, an angry God means that somebody somewhere does care. In a world where human indifference is so pervasive, divine refusal of indifference is everything. And I remember, I find that to be so challenging and interesting that we should celebrate divine anger because it means that there is no victim anywhere that is not seen. You and I don't mean to impugn you, but I go about my business, like we pick up the New York Times, we feel bad about what we read, and we can go on about our day. And Heschel's argument is that the God of the prophets is not like that. The God of the prophets is infuriated by injustice. The God of the Bible is, right, can't tolerate cruelty. I think that there's something quite moving about that. What I think is harder is that when you read the Bible, there's a lot of overkill, literally and figuratively. It's like, okay, God gets angry, but really, does God need to have a tantrum, right? So there, I think, as a question about how to wrestle with biblical texts, I'm totally with you. But I'm a little persuaded, I have to say, by this idea that divine anger is like an idea that's worth much deeper wrestling with than our first impulse might suggest.
Doesn't it, I'm going to jump in just to ask one more sort of related question, but doesn't it depend what God is getting angry at or about?
Yes, and this is where this goes back to something that I said to Rabbi Treffer a while ago. So I think Heschel makes a lot of God getting angry at immorality and injustice, and makes less of God getting angry at unfaithfulness to God and idol worship. Now, from the biblical perspective, whether or not this is convincing, idolatry is sort of inseparable from immorality, so they are interwoven. But yeah, I think Heschel's reading is somewhat selective. It is certainly somewhat selective. I mean, I think that that's right and that's fair. But as you know, for the prophets, to one degree or another, idolatry and immorality often go hand in hand. So you can't fully separate them either. But I suspect that Heschel emphasizes the divine anger in response to immorality because that resonates with him more. That doesn't solve the biblical problem. Wayne, and then Rabbi Streifer, and then maybe we'll call it a night because I want to honor people's time.
We spoke about anger at our Torah study last Saturday, and well, from a liberal point of view, I don't think I could talk this way in front of a more observant Orthodox group. Is that we can only relate to God as with our own emotions. So if we believe that the Torah was not handed down to us by God, but the Torah was canonized as a oral tradition. Stories have been passed through the ages. Well, then of course the story is written by humans, and humans are going to put their emotions into God, and vice versa. How we can only relate to a being that has the same human emotions as we do.
I mean, there's a lot to say about this. I wanna observe that it's worth thinking about how in the Middle Ages, Maimonides, for better or for worse, probably for better and for worse, makes a move that is related to what you're saying. He says the Torah is divine, but the Torah instills some beliefs that are necessary, even if they're not true. That's quite a statement. It teaches some beliefs that are necessary, even if they're not true. And in the ancient world, if you wanted to get people to do the right thing, you invoke the threat of divine anger, which for Maimonides, in contrast to for Heschel, is not literally a thing. It's a way you talk. And then I think implicit there is, as people mature, they might talk that way less. Those are two very different ways of thinking about anger, right? For Heschel, no, we should champion divine anger in the right ways. For Maimonides, no, I mean, anger, yeah, that's what you do when you threaten people who used to be slaves. You understand, Wayne, how that's a response to what you're saying? It's a way of saying, like, not every attribution to God ought to be taken literally. What I find interesting about Maimonides is that doesn't appeal to, oh yeah, well, it's human anyway. I mean, that's another strategy one could take. That sort of appeals to, no, why might a divine text nevertheless communicate things that are not literally the way the world is? Micah?
Well, Renell hasn't spoken yet, so
Oh,
if it's okay, let's
there
go
are
to
more hands
Renell.
up. Okay. Renell, please. Renell, you're muted. You're muted. No, now you're frozen. No. Still muted.
Renell, I'm going to click on ask to unmute. Hopefully that'll do it. Are you able to click and unmute? There we go.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, Rabbi Holt, sorry, this is completely off the tack, but I used to teach at Heschel, and I'm very interested in this wonder and amazement. I mean, I haven't been into anything as deeply as this, but I just wonder how you feel about the way they use it in the school. You've got to know something about this, because out of Harvard alone, they've done courses, and the Heschel people have come to listen. Do they use it in the sense that you've been explaining it? Or is it wonder and amazement in looking at the world for the kids?
So I don't know about the Heschel School in Toronto.
Okay.
I will say this.
It's similar to the one in New York.
I will say this. I think that this is going to be a really morbid thing to say, but I think it
Oh,
is the tragic fate of all great thinkers to end up being domesticated. Think about what the United States of America has done to Martin Luther King. It has turned him into a teddy bear in order to celebrate him, and as a way of not hearing almost any of the things he said about American society: militarism, materialism, racism, the evils of America as he saw them. I think that with Heschel, you get something similar. You know what? I mean, here I'm kind of being maybe more blunt than I should. One of the challenges you have in Jewish day schools is that you have parents who don't want to hear about the radical political implications of
okay,
some of the most important religious thinkers. So, how
right.
do you get, you know, rich, successful, self-satisfied people to observe Martin Luther King Day? You make Martin Luther King harmless. And
No, I
I
think
think the
it's a very
same
good
thing
point.
the same thing happens with Heschel, is that the sting gets taken out. Um,
Or it's looked at a different way, which suits the school and the people there.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't, there are ways in which I'm sure that there are ideas in Heschel that are taken seriously, but I think there's a kind of domestication. Um,
Yeah.
Look, I see it in, I send my kids to a Jewish day school here in Westchester, and you know, there is a committee that is focused on quote unquote political diversity, which amounts to not allowing us to say anything,
Mm,
right? I mean, I
very
don't,
scary.
I don't know what everyone's here's political views are, but like, if I can't say that Torah has some choice things to say about Trumpianism, well, then I'm not saying much.
That's right.
Um,
Think if
Phil, you
you're
want the
sending
last
your
word?
kids to that school, you've
I'm
got to
sorry?
listen to what, if you're sending your kids to that school, you need to be able to listen to what the school is telling you and teaching the children. Anyway, sorry, go on to with what you need to do, and thank you for your answer.
Phil, you get the last question
Yeah,
or comment.
we talked about God's anger at injustice. So what, in Heschel's view, why should we care if God's angry?
That's a really good question, a really interesting question. I think that Heschel, well, there's something I'm tempted to say, but I'm not quite sure it's helpful, which is, if we claim, which is obviously a big if we claim to be worshiping God, then we have no choice to be paying attention to the things that God cares about. In other words, this is where the radicalism, this goes back to what Renell was bringing up, I think. The radicalism that emerges is, look, let me just speak personally for a minute. If this is, and pardon me if this sounds exhibitionistic, but it's actually like something I struggle with a lot. One of the things that has become really hard for me is I've spent more and more of my time teaching Tanakh, teaching the Hebrew Bible, is my anxiety that I have never for one moment in my life really served the God who loves widows, orphans, and strangers. So if we care about serving the God of Torah, then we have to care that God is angry at injustice. Right? Now, but that's a big if. Many people would say, well, I don't really care. But I think when Heschel is writing about this, he's writing to people who presumably do care. And I think he would probably also argue, if there's a God and that God cares, it's just being false to who you are as a human being to be indifferent to God's care. Right? If it's almost like saying, yeah, it's indifference to my own parents. And obviously that's complicated by, there are abusive parents, there are, right, but I think I'm saying two things. One is, if you care, the picture of the God who cares about the widows and the orphans is shattering. And if you don't care, I think Heschel wonders why not. But that's my I don't like the second half of my answer. I don't think it's a good one. I'm working on formulating it as we speak.
But would he be one of the traditionalists that would say you should care because if God's happy with you, you're going to have a great time in the world to come after you pass away, and that if God's angry at you, you're not?
No, you don't. I mean, he might think that, but he never says that I'm aware of. Does not the like, you know, love the orphan or else. But I think you're asking some of the questions that people have asked tonight are really, really hard. Really kind of get at the meat of what he's doing. So I actually really want to thank you. These questions are, I spent years of my life reading and writing about Heschel's ideas, and some of the questions tonight really brought me up short. Really, really interesting. Thank you for engaging so deeply with his ideas and my presentation.
So let me just say a huge thank you to you for speaking with us tonight. This was fascinating, and I have about 17 more questions. And maybe I'll
let's
email you
make a
later.
time to talk, Mike. I'm happy.
Yeah, that would be great. Just thank you on behalf of Kolami, on behalf of our Adult Ed Committee. Thank you to Rabbi Shai Held. And let me also say thank you again to the Adult Education Committee, some of whom are here with us this evening, who have worked very hard to put together this programming throughout the year. So everybody have a great night. And again, thank you to Rabbi Held for being with us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good talk.
Thank
It was
you,
most-
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Really wonderful.
It's gone.